The trajectory of the man who would one day hold the purse strings of a revolution began not with a grand political declaration, but with a tragic, almost absurd maritime accident in the Chesapeake Bay. It was July 12, 1750. The humidity of the Maryland summer hung heavy over the port of Oxford, a bustling tobacco depot where the smells of cured leaf and pine tar saturated the air. Robert Morris Sr., a gregarious and successful factor for the Liverpool mercantile firm Foster, Cunliffe & Sons, had spent the afternoon aboard a trading vessel in the harbor. The elder Morris was a man of the world, a commercial agent who had thrived in the colonies. As he prepared to depart the ship and return to shore in a small longboat, the ship's captain, adhering to the naval customs of the era, ordered a cannon salute to honor his departing guest. The gunner stood ready with the lit match. The captain, intending to signal the fire once the small boat was safely clear, raised his hand. At that precise moment, a fly landed on the captain's nose. He swatted at it, a reflex action. The gunner, interpreting the gesture as the command to fire, lowered the match. The cannon roared. The longboat was perilously close, scarcely 20 yards from the hull. The cannon had been loaded with a wadding, a dense, hardened mass of paper and cloth used to pack the gunpowder. This projectile, moving with lethal velocity, struck Robert Morris Sr. in the arm, shattering the bone and tearing flesh. The wound was catastrophic. In an age before antiseptics, the dirty wadding caused immediate and severe infection. Septicemia set in rapidly. 3 days later, the father was dead, killed by a gesture of respect gone terribly wrong. His son, Robert Morris Jr., was only 16 years old. He had arrived from England just 3 years prior. A boy with sandy-colored hair and piercing blue eyes, abruptly orphaned in a new world. He inherited a modest estate of roughly £2,500 and a terrifying independence. But he also inherited his father's mercantile instincts. He had already been apprenticed to Charles Willing, a titan of Philadelphia commerce, and the counting house became his sanctuary. The tragedy in the harbor taught him a lesson that would define his financial career. Fortune is capricious, and security is an illusion. Morris threw himself into the machinery of trade. He did not merely learn the business, he mastered the chaotic, multivariable calculus of 18th century logistics. He understood how to balance the price of flour in Pennsylvania against the demand for sugar in the West Indies and the credit markets of London. When Charles Willing died, Morris partnered with the son, Thomas Willing, forming Willing, Morris & Coors in 1757. It became the premier commercial house in America, its ships crisscrossing the Atlantic, its ledger books a map of the known world's resources. By 1775, as the political skies darkened between the colonies and Great Britain, Morris was a merchant prince. He was initially reluctant to seek separation from the crown, fearing the anarchy that might follow the collapse of established authority. He was a man of order, and revolution is the antithesis of order. Yet, when the conflict became inevitable, Morris brought his formidable logistical mind to the patriot cause. He was not a soldier, he was a master of supply. Congress appointed him to the Secret Committee of Trade, a body tasked with a mission that was essentially state-sponsored smuggling on a continental scale. The Continental Army was desperate. They lacked not just uniforms and food, but the very chemistry of war, saltpeter and sulfur for gunpowder. Morris turned his private commercial network into a clandestine supply chain. He utilized his agents in the Caribbean and Europe to purchase munitions, hiding them beneath legitimate cargoes of tobacco and indigo. He instructed captains to evade the Royal Navy blockade, turning the firm of Willing & Morris into the logistical backbone of the rebellion. The work was perilous. Morris operated in the shadows, meeting in quiet rooms to authorize shipments that, if discovered, would mark him for hanging. He mixed public funds with private credit, a necessity in a time when the United States had no credit rating. He risked his own fleet, his own fortune, and his own name. In the winter of 1776, when Congress fled Philadelphia in panic as British troops advanced, Morris remained behind. He walked the streets of the abandoned capital, effectively functioning as the entire executive government, ensuring that supplies continued to flow to George Washington's freezing army on the banks of the Delaware. It was here, in the crucible of the war's darkest hour, that Morris's legend was forged. Washington, preparing for the desperate strike at Trenton, sent a frantic request. The troops' enlistments were expiring, and they would not march without hard cash. Paper money was worthless. Morris did not have public funds. He went out into the city, rousing wealthy Quakers and associates from their beds, pledging his personal word that they would be repaid. He scraped together the silver and gold. The money was sent. The troops marched. The revolution lived. Morris had gambled his personal solvency on the survival of the nation. He had woven his own financial fate so tightly with that of the United States that they could no longer be separated. But as the war dragged on, the line between the patriot and the profiteer blurred in the eyes of his enemies. He was building a nation, yes, but he was also building an empire of his own, one that would soon demand a monument. By the early 1790s, the smoke of the battlefield had cleared, replaced by the dust of construction and the frantic energy of a new republic. Robert Morris stood at the zenith of his power. He was a senator for Pennsylvania, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution, one of only 2 men to affix his name to all 3 charters of freedom. He was the Financier, the man who had established the Bank of North America, the first federally chartered bank, and stabilized the nation's credit. In the capital city of Philadelphia, Morris was a colossus. He owned the finest existing mansion on Market Street, a brick structure of stately proportions. With a gesture that typified his view of the relationship between wealth and state, he had vacated this home to allow President George Washington to use it as the executive residence, moving his own family to a smaller dwelling next door. The Morris home was the social epicenter of the federal period, a place where business, politics, and society merged in a swirl of high-stakes diplomacy. But Morris's ambition had outgrown brick and mortar. He looked at the expanding nation, a nation he felt he had purchased with his own credit, and saw limitless potential. He began to acquire land with a hunger that bordered on mania. He believed that the chaos in Europe, particularly the French Revolution, would drive millions of immigrants to American shores. He intended to own the ground they would walk on. He purchased millions of acres in western New York, the Genesee Country, in Virginia, in Georgia, and in the Carolinas. He was not buying to settle. He was buying to sell, a speculator betting on the future demographics of a continent. To reflect this new status as the greatest landowner in America, Morris commissioned a residence that would rival the Chateau of France and the manor houses of England. He purchased a massive lot on Chestnut Street, spanning the entire block between 7th and 8th Streets. For the design, he turned to Major Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the brilliant but volatile French engineer who had laid out the grand plan for the new federal city on the Potomac. L'Enfant's vision for Morris's mansion was unprecedented in the austere Quaker city. It was to be a palace of marble and brick, a Beaux-Arts giant with mansard roofs, grand salons, and sculpture gardens. Construction began in 1794 with an excavation that stunned the city. The foundation hole was enormous, digging deep into the Pennsylvania clay to support the massive weight of the intended structure. L'Enfant, a perfectionist who had been dismissed from the Washington, D.C. project for his refusal to compromise, found in Morris an indulgent patron who simply signed the checks. Immense slabs of pale blue and white marble were carted in from quarries, lining the streets around the site. Masons and carpenters worked tirelessly, raising the walls. The house was designed to be a capital messuage, a physical manifestation of Morris's belief in the permanence of American wealth. It featured 2 stories of underground vaults and service areas, leading to rumors among the populace of secret tunnels and dungeons. The facade rose slowly, a testament to opulence that seemed to mock the frugality of the earlier revolutionary years. As the marble blocks were stacked higher, Morris continued to expand his financial empire. He formed the North American Land Company in 1795, consolidating over 6 million acres into a trust, issuing stock that he planned to sell to European nobility. He was leveraging everything, his reputation, his past success, and his future profits, to build this marble dream. But the structure on Chestnut Street was rising into a sky that was already beginning to darken. The sheer scale of the project was draining cash at an alarming rate. L'Enfant was tearing down work as fast as he put it up, dissatisfied with the aesthetics, demanding more expensive materials. Morris, distracted by the complex web of his land deals, let the costs spiral. The mansion stood there, walls climbing, roof open to the heavens, a skeletal giant of stone. It was a masterpiece in progress, a symbol of what America could be. It was magnificent. It was bold. And as the winter of 1796 approached, it was dangerously unfinished. We pause here with the marble walls rising unfinished above the city, a monument to an ambition that has not yet met its reckoning. The descent of Robert Morris was not a sudden plummet but a slow, suffocating constriction, driven by the machinery of speculation he had helped to build. The optimism that had fueled the Marble Palace was based on a premise that was rapidly proving false, that credit was infinite and that Europe would pay for America's expansion. By 1796, the geopolitical landscape had shifted tectonically. The French Revolutionary Wars had engulfed the continent, turning the banking capitals of Amsterdam and Paris into fortresses of caution. The Dutch bankers, upon whom Morris and his partners had pinned their hopes for purchasing the North American Land Company stock, were paralyzed by the French invasion of the Netherlands. The British, engaged in a fight for survival, restricted capital flow. The tsunami of wealthy European immigrants did not arrive. Instead, the Atlantic became a barrier of naval blockades and seized ships. Morris was not alone in this exposure. He had taken on partners, most notably John Nicholson, the Comptroller General of Pennsylvania, and James Greenleaf, a dashing figure from a prominent Boston family who had served as a consul in Amsterdam. Greenleaf was the catalyst for disaster. He had seduced Morris with tales of easy Dutch credit and vast loans that were essentially mirages. Greenleaf had purchased millions of shares and acres on promises he could not keep, and when his schemes collapsed, the burden fell upon Morris and Nicholson to buy him out. The mechanics of their ruin were complex. To keep the North American Land Company afloat, Morris and Nicholson engaged in a desperate game of kiting notes. They would pay off a maturing debt by issuing a new note to a different creditor, often at higher interest. They circulated paper endorsed by each other, creating a labyrinth of obligations that totaled nearly $10 million. A sum so staggering in the 1790s that it exceeded the expenditures of the federal government. The panic of 1796-1797 struck the final blow. It was the first true financial depression of the young republic, triggered by the collapse of the land bubble and the Bank of England's suspension of specie payments. Credit evaporated overnight. In Philadelphia, the mercantile heart of the nation, the silence in the counting houses was terrifying. Men who had been millionaires on paper weeks prior were suddenly insolvent. Morris's notes, once considered as good as gold, began to trade at a deep discount. Then they stopped trading altogether. The Financier found himself in the humiliating position of dodging the very people he had once commanded. He spent his days writing frantic letters, his handwriting becoming cramped and urgent. "I am in a constant state of torture," he confessed to Nicholson. "I have not a dollar to bless myself with." The public perception of Morris shifted violently. The man who had saved the Revolution was now caricatured as a swindler, a symbol of aristocratic greed. The Marble Palace on Chestnut Street became a lightning rod for this anger. Work stopped completely. The unpaid masons walked off the job. The unroofed walls were left exposed to the Pennsylvania winter, the imported marbles staining in the rain. The citizens of Philadelphia, watching the decay of the grandest house in America, began to call it by a new name. Morris's Folly. As 1797 wore on, the situation turned from professional embarrassment to physical danger. In the 18th century, debt was not a civil matter resolved in bankruptcy court. It was a criminal offense punishable by indefinite imprisonment. Creditors began to issue writs of attachment. Sheriffs prowled the streets of Philadelphia looking for the former senator. Morris retreated. He abandoned the city house, which was too accessible to the public. He moved his family, his loyal wife Mary and his daughter Maria, to the Hills, his beloved country estate on the Schuylkill River. It was a beautiful property, famous for its hothouses and lemon trees, but now it would serve a darker purpose. It was isolated. It was defensible. It was the only place left where the law could not easily touch him. Inside the estate, Morris looked out at the river, watching for the approach of deputies. He had become a prisoner in his own garden, a man who owned a continent of land but could not walk past his own gate without risking arrest. The fever of speculation had broken, leaving him shivering in the cold reality of ruin. The winter of 1797-1798 turned the Hills into a fortress of despair. The estate, once a pastoral retreat where Morris grew exotic pineapples and entertained dignitaries, was now Castle Defiance. Under Pennsylvania law, a debtor was safe from arrest as long as he remained inside his own dwelling. The sanctity of the home was absolute, but the threshold was the line of demarcation between freedom and incarceration. The siege was literal and psychological. Creditors hired agents to camp at the perimeter of the property. They watched the gates. They watched the riverbanks. These men, whom Morris and Nicholson referred to in their daily correspondence as keyhole friends, would peer through windows and try to trick the servants into opening doors. Morris paced the floorboards, a lion trapped in a golden cage, armed with a telescope to scan the grounds for intruders. His correspondence with John Nicholson, who was similarly barricaded in his own Philadelphia home, dubbed Fort Nicholson, provides a harrowing window into their daily terror. They exchanged notes carried by trusted messengers who slipped through the lines. They plotted, they commiserated, and they maintained a grim humor about their predicament. "I am in a state of siege," Morris wrote, "but I will defend my castle to the last." Life inside the Hills was a study in contrasts. The house was filled with the trappings of wealth, fine furniture, silver plate, and artwork, yet the family was living on the edge of subsistence. The food stocks dwindled. The firewood ran low. The servants, loyal but unpaid, fended off the aggressive agents who pounded on the doors shouting threats. Mary White Morris, a woman of immense dignity who had once been the second lady of the land, managed the household with stoic resolve, enduring the humiliation of having her home turned into a prison. The pressure intensified as the small creditors grew desperate. While the large banks moved slowly, the tradesmen and shopkeepers who held Morris's notes were facing their own ruin. One such man was George Eddy. Eddy was not a distant financier. He was a local creditor who felt personally betrayed. He was relentless, vicious in his pursuit, and immune to the social graces that protected Morris from his peers. Eddy's agents were the most aggressive, prowling the grounds day and night, making sleep impossible. The breaking point arrived in February 1798. The winter cold was biting, and the isolation was absolute. The psychological strain of the cat-and-mouse game had exhausted Morris. Rumors swirled that the creditors were planning to storm the house by force, law or no law. The physical safety of his wife and daughter became his primary concern. The end came on February 15, 1798, precipitated by a confrontation with George Eddy. The details suggest a moment of inevitable surrender. Eddy's pressure had breached the perimeter, Morris realizing that the sanctity of his castle was no longer a guarantee of safety, and perhaps seeing that the siege would only end in violence or starvation, made the decision to submit. He wrote a final, resigned letter to Nicholson. "George Eddy threatened to arrest me, and I sent for the sheriff to take me into custody." It was an act of agency in a situation where he had none left. He would not be dragged out like a criminal. He would invite the law in. When the sheriff arrived, Morris was ready. He had dressed with the care of a man preparing for a cabinet meeting. He said goodbye to Mary and Mariah, promising them that this was the only way to resolve the standoff. He stepped out of the door of the hills, crossing the threshold that had been his sanctuary. He was arrested immediately. As the carriage took him away from the river and toward the city, he passed the unfinished skeleton of Morris's Folly on Chestnut Street. The marble walls stood silent and stained, a tombstone for his ambition. The carriage did not stop there. It continued to the corner of Prune and 6th Streets. The Financier of the Revolution was led through the gates of the Prune Street Debtors Apartment. The lock turned. The siege was over. The imprisonment had begun. The Prune Street Debtors Apartment was a purgatory of brick and iron, physically adjacent to the Walnut Street Prison, but socially a world apart. It was designed for the gentle confinement of the insolvent, distinct from the hardened criminals next door. But the distinction was largely academic to a man of Morris's station. He was assigned a room he bitterly described as an ugly, whitewashed vault. It was damp, scantily furnished, and barred from the outside world. Life in the prison was a grotesque parody of normal society. Inmates were not locked in cells during the day. They roamed a common courtyard and hallways. Morris found himself surrounded by the wreckage of the American economy, partners, rivals, and strangers, all reduced to the same common denominator of debt. The criminal side of the prison was separated only by a low wall in the exercise yard. Bands of ruffians would climb over to taunt the debtors, steal their food, or throw refuse into their area. The noise was constant, a cacophony of swearing, chains, and the despair of the destitute. Morris attempted to maintain his dignity. He set up a desk in his cell, trying to organize his chaotic accounts. He brought in books and a few personal comforts, but the humiliation was total. He was inmate Morris, dependent on the charity of friends for decent food, as the prison rations were barely edible. His health began to deteriorate rapidly. The asthma that had plagued him for years worsened in the stagnant air of the prison, and his legs swelled with dropsy. The true horror arrived in the summer of 1798, shortly after his incarceration. Yellow fever, the recurring scourge of Philadelphia, swept through the city. In the crowded, unsanitary confines of the prison, it was a massacre. The disease moved from cell to cell. Morris watched as his fellow inmates sickened, turned yellow, and died in agony. The whitewashed vaults became death chambers. The sound of the dead carts rumbling over the cobblestones outside was the background noise of his days. It was during this plague that Mary White Morris proved herself to be of the same steel as the soldiers at Valley Forge. She did not flee the city. She visited her husband daily. She walked through streets deserted by all but the dying and the doctors. She entered the prison, walking down corridors where coffins were stacked from floor to ceiling, waiting for transport. She dined with him in his cell, bringing news and comfort, risking her life with every breath she took in that infected house. "My distress pierces my heart," Morris wrote, fearing for her safety more than his own. In this darkest timeline, a moment of profound grace occurred. In late 1798, George Washington traveled to Philadelphia. The former president was the most revered man in the Western world, the living symbol of the nation. For him to associate with a bankrupt prisoner was a social risk. The stigma of debt was a stain that usually ended friendships. Washington did not hesitate. He went to Prune Street. He walked through the prison gates and into the debtor's apartment. He found his old friend in the whitewashed vault. They shared a meal, sober and quiet, stripped of the wine and fanfare of their glory days, but rich in loyalty. Washington's visit was a silent rebuke to a country that had discarded its financier. It was a statement: this man is still a patriot. Washington went further. He wrote to Mary Morris inviting her and Maria to stay at Mount Vernon to escape the misery of their situation. "Be assured we ever have, and still do retain the most affectionate regard for you," he wrote. It was a lifeline of honor, acknowledging that while Morris's wallet was empty, his character remained valued by the father of the country. For 3.5 years, Morris remained in that cell. He missed the wedding of his daughter. He missed the death of Washington in 1799, a blow that severed his last link to the heroic age. He sat in the Prune Street apartment, a living ghost, while the country he had financed moved on without him. But his suffering was not entirely in vain. The spectacle of a founding father rotting in prison shamed the Congress. It forced a reckoning with the barbarity of the laws, leading to the passage of the Bankruptcy Act of 1800, a piece of legislation designed in no small part to set him free. On August 26, 1801, the heavy iron door of the Prune Street Debtors apartment swung open. Robert Morris walked out into the sunlight of a Philadelphia that had fundamentally changed. He was 67 years old, his health shattered, his gait slow and painful. He was free, but he was destitute. The millions of acres were gone, sold for fractions of pennies to satisfy the insatiable debts. The merchant prince was now a pauper, dependent on the annuity secured for his wife by Gouverneur Morris to keep a roof over his head. He moved into a small, modest house on 12th Street, a stark, cramping contrast to the grand residences of his past. There were no more levees, no more ships arriving from Canton, no more secret committees in smoke-filled taverns. He spent his final years in quiet obscurity, a man out of time, tended to by the faithful Mary. He died on May 8, 1806, and was buried in the family vault behind Christ Church. There was no state funeral. The nation was too busy growing into the empire he had predicted to pause for the man who had paid for its birth. But to understand the true end of Robert Morris's story, we must return to the image that we left suspended in the skyline of Philadelphia: Morris's Folly. When Morris entered prison, the Marble Palace was an unfinished shell. When he emerged, it was a ruin. The creditors, in their scramble to recover assets, had seized the land and the materials. But the house was too massive, too eccentric, and too expensive for anyone else to finish. It stood for years as a haunting landmark, a monument to human instability. Eventually, the order was given to dismantle it. The great marble blocks, imported with such hope, were sold off piece by piece. The architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who would go on to shape the U.S. Capitol, purchased many of the marble slabs. He cut them down and repurposed them for other buildings and monuments across the city. The pale stone that was meant to house the Financier was scattered, embedded into the facades of banks and row houses throughout Philadelphia. The Folly did not disappear. It was absorbed into the fabric of the city, just as Morris's financial innovations were absorbed into the fabric of the nation. The hole in the ground where the foundation had been was filled in. The land was subdivided. Sansom Street was cut through the block. The physical trace of his vanity was erased, leaving only the bustling commerce of the street, commerce that his credit had made possible.